On September 29, 1838, Nicollet's expedition reached the shores of Minnewacan, now known as Spirit Lake. Nicollet described the area as one of the most beautiful sights I have seen in the far west. And today, it remains a major vacation site in the region. After living and traveling with the Dakota for a few years, Nicollet also seems to have developed a fascination with their legends. The erroneously named Eastern Sioux, also known as the Santee and Dakota, were 4 of the 7 nations. The name Santee derives from a debated word commonly interpreted as the people of the knife or the guardians of the frontier. For centuries, the Santee lived west of the Mississippi River, keeping most tribes on the other side of the river. The 4 Santee tribes were the Wahpeton, Warpacootie, Sisseton, and the Mdewakanton. Without a fixed border, the Wahpeton, Warpacootie, and Sisseton ranged all across South Dakota, southern Minnesota, and upper Iowa. But it was the northern band, the Mdewakanton, that Nicollet first met at Fort Snelling. The name Mdewakanton means the dwellers of Spirit Lake. At one time, the Mdewakanton lived in the forests of northern Minnesota with Lake Mille Lacs as their spiritual center. According to several traditions, Mille Lacs was a sacred place, and the island within the lake was an island of creation from which mankind first appeared. Spirit Lake was more than just a ghost lake. It was analogous to a Garden of Eden. When the Anishinaabe began to push into the Great Lakes region, searching for their own spiritual Turtle Island, a century-long conflict began. After an alliance with the French, which gave the Anishinaabe rifles and even explosives, the Battle of Cathio forced the Mdewakanton from the lands they guarded. By the time Nicollet arrived in northern Minnesota, the Anishinaabe had lived in the forests and lakes region for almost a century. Yet, he still visited several spirit lakes of the Dakota during his mapping expedition, including a spirit lake near Duluth, Itasca at the headwaters of the French-named Mille Lacs. Along his route, if there was a lake with an island, Nicollet veered towards it. Today, I'm standing at the Gardner cabin at Lake Okoboji. In the spring of 1857, a Warpacootie chief by the name of Inkpaduta led 14 warriors on a raid that saw 40 settlers slaughtered in the area and 4 women taken prisoner, including young Abby Gardner. While this was the last armed conflict in Iowa, it was a precursor to more violence that would occur 5 years later, when broken promises and failed treaties resulted in the Dakota War of 1862 in Minnesota. While many of the issues seen in both the Spirit Lake Massacre and the Dakota Conflict of 1862 had their roots in Nicollet's era. When Nicollet arrived at Fort Snelling in 1836, war was brewing between the Dakota in the south and the Anishinaabe in the north, with Lawrence Tolliver acting as mediator between these 2 powerful nations. Nicollet helped bring both sides to the negotiation table and was part of the 1837 Treaty of St. Peter that meant to define the border of the 2 nations. While it seemed that Nicollet had brought peace to Minnesota, a terrible smallpox epidemic spread from a fort on the distant Missouri River and across the Great Plains. Within a year, countless members of the mighty 7 Council Fires, known by Americans as the Sioux, had died in a single winter. Nicollet spent 1838 and 1839 learning the customs, history, and nature of the Yankton and Dakota tribes, with plans to return to Washington, D.C. to not only represent the interests of men like Chief Sleepy Eyes and Juanetta, but to write a book about both the Chippewa and Sioux customs for his numerous fans in America and in Europe to read. Unfortunately, Nicollet died before significant work could be completed, and within a generation, the policies and tone in the region quickly soured. While men like Tiope, Good Thunder, Renville, and the Faribaults did their best to help the Dakota transition into a new era, others fought against the changing times. When Inkpaduta slaughtered pioneers in the Spirit Lake area, he did so because many of the signed treaties in the days of Nicollet were broken or ignored, causing food shortages and starvation for a people trying to transition from a nomadic life to a farm life in the new reservations. While there were many factors for the sudden violence, bitterness began as early as Nicollet's time. While it was Chief Little Crow who was the figurehead for the Dakota people during the war, it was his right-hand man, Cutnose, who led the vicious guerrilla campaign against settlers. To my surprise, I learned during my research of Joseph Nicollet that he hired the savage war chief in the autumn of 1838 to guide him to Spirit Lake. While the accounts of Cutnose during the Dakota conflict are well chronicled, his early life is not well known. Originally named Stands on a Cloud, he earned a new name during a brutal fight with John Otherday, a fellow Dakota who accepted the changing times. In their fight, Otherday purportedly bit off a chunk of his nose, leaving him with a gruesome wound and festering resentment toward change. Cutnose also had issues with promiscuity and drunkenness, bouncing from village to village. Despite all of this, Nicollet hired him to be part of his expedition. Although Nicollet never explains what happened, Cutnose was fired from the expedition a week before arriving at Spirit Lake for breaking his word to Nicollet. Nicollet was forced to find his way back to Faribault and Fort Snelling without a guide prior to the arrival of winter, never to mention Cutnose again. Yet history remembers the names Nicollet and Cutnose for two very different reasons. After a risky trip to Spirit Lake in Iowa, Nicollet returned to visit Lura Lake before returning to Fort Snelling just in time for winter. But what did he do in 1839? Nicollet made his longest expedition, traveling by steamship from St. Louis to Fort Pierre to travel into the buffalo hunting grounds of Chief Juanetta at Devil's Lake, North Dakota, which the Yankton tribe called, you guessed it, Minnewacan, or Spirit Lake.